This is the Classical Top 5. I'm Tommy Pearson. We've reached the end of the year, a year that, quite frankly, all of us will probably be glad to see the back of, or at least we would if we didn't think that much of 2021 looked like being the same. Who knows? But for me, one of the few great pleasures to be had this year has been making this podcast. Every week diving into a huge collection of music and performers, helped often by a special guest. And what an incredible collection of guests we've had. I hope you'll agree. So to end our podcast for the year, I thought it'd be fun to look back over the series so far. The guests, the music, the discoveries, the surprises perhaps, the wild suggestions, there have been plenty of them, and controversies, there have been a few. We've recorded nearly 40 episodes now, would you believe it? So there's been plenty to choose from. And thank you to all our loyal listeners for sticking with us and for throwing at us the most incredible, knowledgeable, fascinating, surprising suggestions week after week. We're also going to look back on the year generally, as it's been such an unprecedented time for the performing arts. And at the end of the show, great excitement here, there'll be a chance for you to win an exclusive Classical Top 5 face mask in our first ever competition. You don't want to miss that. Richard Bratby and Charlotte Gardner are here with me, of course, and I'm so pleased to say that we've also been joined by Fiona Maddox, who was with us from the beginning up to the summer when she unaccountably and quite unreasonably left us because she had too much actual work to do. Fiona, how wonderful to see you again. How have you been? What have you been up to since we last heard from you?
Well, actually, in a sense, more of the same. I thought it would all change. And it's just gone on in much the same way. And I thought, how silly of me to give this up, this slot. But I think Charlotte has given you all sorts of insights that I couldn't possibly have managed. So
there's been a lot of change there. I mean, you say not much has changed, and of course that's true, but things have shifted a bit. I mean, when we started this podcast, of course, we were in actual lockdown, weren't we? In national lockdown. And so we were all stuck in our houses and there was nothing open at all. Things are a bit different now, aren't they? And of course, things in the performing world and the things that you've been writing about, Fiona, in the Observer every week, there has been stuff to write about. There has been stuff to watch.
There's been more than enough stuff to watch. The difficulty is partly national newspapers are suffering and pages are down, so space is down. So instead of having, 1,000 words, I often have 300 words. Yeah. And perhaps, as this week, about 5 different things that I've stood in front of my computer and watched. Luckily, the Wi-Fi better than it sometimes is. And I just want people to know that musicians are doing these things, and not only critically to look at them, but also to support their activities.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because it does seem to a lot of writers, I think, are feeling quite a responsibility on, as far as that's concerned, to show real sort of support, public support for performing arts groups that are often struggling, and the thing that you're watching is really the only thing they can possibly do.
There's also the fact that there are a lot of CDs have come out, including ones made in lockdown. And I've really just week after week made my own little plea with the Observer to let me have that space, because it's about the only income anybody is getting. And it might be minute income, but if the few places that can give a platform to these recordings, it's really a sort of responsibility to, I think. I don't know whether Richard and Charlotte have found that as well.
Well, Richard, you this week, one of your most entertaining articles in The Spectator, all about Jonas Kaufmann's much discussed on this platform Christmas album.
I think you're all too mean. You're all too mean.
I thought you were quite generous about it.
I was very clear.
But to be fair to Richard, what's been nice, I guess The Spectator has afforded you the opportunity to actually have a reasonable amount of writing and some decent lengths of articles this year.
The magazines have been the sort of golden thread that has kept me going throughout the year. Magazine articles, CD reviews, particularly from Gramophone. I'm very grateful to them, and also some lovely feature opportunities. But yeah, The Spectator. The great thing is, they've been putting on sales through the year by all accounts. They're sort of hitting a record high, I understand, as they reach the end of the year. And again, they're one of the few British publications which has actually massively increased its arts coverage in recent years. I think the amount of classical music coverage has pretty much doubled in the past 2 to 3 years. The Spectator. On the other hand, any publication, editors tend to have very strong views on what you cover. Quite often they have a good editor will play to the strengths of their writers and will sort of find things that will bring them out, perhaps challenge them, perhaps sort of push them in unexpected directions. And my editor is extremely open-minded, extremely broad-minded. There are certain things he's keen on, certain things he's not. He will let me quite happily write about things he's not keen on a lot of the time, but not always. I mean, for instance, the Christmas album, I was asked to write about it, so I wrote about it. And a few weeks ago, I was asked to write about the symphonies of Franz Schmidt. There's been a recording recently with Paavo Järvi that attracted some comment online. And again, I was asked to write about that, and it was a subject about which I had mixed feelings. I'm not a complete massive enthusiast for this particular composer, Schmidt. There are a couple of his works I find very, very powerful and do enjoy. And I kind of said this. I kind of sort of went through the nuances of it and tried to say, well, I'm a bit ambivalent about this. He might be worth listening. He might be your sort of thing. Might not. I like this. I'm not so sure about this. But anyway, the CDs are out there, and see what you think. And of course, this instantly online, this was hailed as Brabby hates Franz Schmidt. So, oh my God, Brabby loves Franz Schmidt. What's wrong with him? And that's it. Instantly, it polarizes. It splits. Not helped by the fact that this composer had certain relationships, shall we say, with the immediately pre-war government of Germany. Not the nicest bunch of people. And I tried to sort of address this in a reasonably historically informed and tactful way, but of course there's no way. Yeah, it's one of those real don't touch it with a barge pole subjects. It was horrible, and then you're defending a Nazi, and oh my God, a heroic defense of him against a false accusation of Nazism. And I wasn't really trying to do any of that, but that's a job. And I was very glad to have it.
Charlotte, you spent a lot of time reviewing recordings, of course. I know that when we first started this podcast, one of the things Fiona pointed out was that suddenly she wasn't going to 3 operas a week, and that actually that was a huge kind of shift physically in the kind of arrangement of doing that and the physical act of going to all of these things. You must have missed concerts as well, that visceral experience.
Completely. I mean, even though from a reviewing perspective, what I'm mostly reviewing is CDs, recordings. My life pre-lockdown, I was getting on a plane or Eurostar most months, maybe even a couple of times, because I was writing feature articles, interviewing people in Germany, Switzerland, France. I will go again to a lot of international music competitions, festivals. So I actually had a particularly international sort of circle of colleagues as well. So that has all changed an awful lot. But the recordings is an interesting, and as Fiona says, just giving people the coverage. That's the one thing that we can do. And funnily, about midway through, I think we've all gone through phases in terms of how we're dealing with lockdown and how we're feeling about it in our heads. And to begin with, it was just the shock. Then it was the getting going, trying to do something. And then I think certainly for me, I reached a point where I suddenly realized that I'm lucky enough to have a couple of places where I'm in complete control of what I write in a column every single month. The editor just lets me get on with it, which is great. But I suddenly realized towards the end of the summer, early autumn, that it didn't actually matter how many times I wrote about what the government should be doing, why we should have more money, all of these things. It wasn't actually going to open up concert halls or do anything. And I actually felt really helpless about it. As a journalist, you are supposed to be somebody who has a voice, who can change things. And it suddenly dawned on me that nothing I could do was going to do that. But then funnily, at exactly the same time, I was receiving, I do a lot with young artists, supporting, championing, reporting on them at competitions. And it suddenly dawned on me that all of these young artists were contacting me, and they were sending me the videos of what they were putting on social media. They were sending me CDs that they had managed to put out despite everything. And I realized that actually as a journalist, what I can be doing is quite simply to be giving space to these people, particularly young artists, because I think this year has been particularly brutal on them. If you are a major star, or even somebody who is, middle of the road in your 40s, our sort of age, you've at least got some savings, hopefully, and you have a profile. But if you're a young artist right at the start of your career, and there's a fairly narrow window as well, where you can get discovered and you're not seen as somebody who clearly hasn't been discovered, and maybe there's a reason for it. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do is feature as many young artists as I possibly can on the various playlists and columns that I've been putting out, and that's helped me psychologically as well, actually.
When we started it, as I said, in lockdown, the first podcast we did was recommending music to listen to in lockdown. I don't think any of us at that point imagined we'd be recording a second program for the second lockdown. And rather horrifyingly, I mean, it's coming out really this week that everybody seems to think that there's going to be another national lockdown in January, particularly following the relaxation of the rules, bizarrely, over Christmas. So maybe we'll save it up for a third lockdown program in the new year. Who knows? But one of the early programs we recorded was how music must change post lockdown, or the music business should change post lockdown. And our guests were Susanna Eastburn and John from Sound of Music, and John Summers, the outgoing chief executive of the Halle. I found that really fascinating because there were some very interesting ideas thrown up in that program. I don't know whether you remember, Fiona, but one of the big ones I think was about touring. And of course, no orchestras have been able to tour this year for obvious reasons. But one of the suggestions was that orchestras should tour less. One of the other big reasons for that was the carbon footprint. And it does seem that now orchestras are now kind of resigned almost to the fact that touring won't be a major part of their life. Although I suspect that they're all just sitting there itching, waiting for the opportunity to do so, because the model is still there. And the sad fact is that most of the London orchestras work off the fact that most of their income comes from touring. My suggestion in the program was that shouldn't be the case. We should change it. But there does seem to be a little bit of a shift. I mean, I guess everybody's been forced into thinking differently, haven't they? But there were a lot of things that came up in that program, I think, that actually are going to happen.
It seems amazing that things that seemed so rigid in the way that everybody expects to behave, orchestras, audiences, the expectation that we can see the LA Phil at the Barbican at least once a year or however often it is, that it's taken this cataclysm to make us all rethink. I don't think we can yet say what the future will be. I can only imagine that it will not be like the past, and that there will be some touring, but it will be much more limited. And there will not be the jumping. I mean, who, not only all of us, but who in an orchestra who might have a family wants to be dashing on a plane when there is still a huge uncertainty about the behavior of this virus, and there is likely to be for certainly a considerable time, as far as we all know.
But one of the other big subjects that came up in that program, Richard, I know that exercised you, was it came up about what audiences actually want, and the sort of the elephant in the room that is that sometimes audiences do actually quite like something reasonably ordinary and
or short
and short, yes, but that we're often not prepared to accept that, because we see so often the art sees itself as having a role in educating the audience.
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, I look back at some of the stuff I was writing near the start of the lockdown period. I don't know. I can't predict any more than anyone else. But I said at one point I suspect escapism is about to become a lot less undervalued over the course of this year. And then what do you know? Glyndebourne does its first ever Offenbach, first ever Offenbach at Glyndebourne, and it was delightful. And it was a joy, and it worked. It was exactly. I thought, Covent Garden put on some awful sort of video thing compiled to a selection of very tedious contemporary composers, the less boring, interesting ones, and a sort of long, gloomy video artists mooching around central London looking sadly at posters, wearing masks. And I just, Jesus, do I have to watch the end of this? I have to, because I'm being paid to. But imagine if I'd paid to see it. And then Glyndebourne, there you go. You've got silly farce, silly people doing silly things to delightful, frothy, light-hearted music, and thank God, this is seriously worth the 8-hour round trip to see it. I actually feel I'm refreshed by this, and that's one perspective, certainly. I mean, getting back to what you were saying about orchestras and so on. I mean, the sort of the 80% of my work that doesn't have my name on it and that people don't generally know I've done, and that actually pays my bills, is kind of helping orchestras plan, helping orchestras market their work. And it's been quite interesting this year. I've been seeing this sort of process from behind, sort of what they're thinking is where they're going. I mean, all these years we've been told orchestras sort of work on this 3-year planning cycle. Things are set in stone. If a CD mysteriously tops the charts on Classic FM, you can forget about hearing that piece next season. It'll be at least 18 months before it makes into a concert programme, by which time everyone has forgotten. But all of a sudden, they're on the hoof, and they're improvising, and they're sort of putting things together, programmes with constraints. How many players can you get on stage when you're socially distanced? What size audience can you fit in? What can we do with the artists who are available in this country and can travel without quarantine? And this sounds a terrible thing to say, and it's not a situation any of us wanted, but some of the results are just exactly the kind of thing that a lot of people have been wishing for years. It's sort of, the programs are getting less predictable.
I totally agree.
People are willing to try out unusual things. I mean, one thing, this is going to sound horribly, horribly cynical indeed. I remember sort of writing all the advertising copy for about 6 orchestras last year. And absolutely everyone, the thing to be seen to be doing at that time was Lily Boulanger and Louise Farrenc. And all those plans have fallen by the wayside. And I'm getting new programs, and everyone has stripped out all those composers and replaced them with a Chevalier de Saint-Georges, with Florence Martin. There's a sort of different impulse there. Yes, Florence Price, sorry. It's quite interesting watching orchestras sort of moving with the tide, sort of cutting their cloth, rethinking what they need to be seen to be doing as well as what they're actually doing. And
that's brilliant.
Again, the thing is that they can move quickly when they need to. They can improvise. They can get creative. And again, likewise, young British-based artists are, I mean, certainly some of them are getting opportunities they possibly wouldn't have had. I mean, pick a profile some of them wouldn't have had because they're available, because they're there, because they don't need to fly or quarantine. And I'm not 100% sure that's a bad thing. It's
it reminds me of there's that wonderful scene at the beginning of Armando Iannucci's film about Stalin. It's based on a true incident where they did a concert, and halfway through the producer got a phone call from Stalin saying, could you send me a recording? But they weren't recording it because it was live on radio. And so they got everyone back in to do the recording, but the conductor didn't want to do it, or was drunk or something like that. So they couldn't use him. So they had to go and find someone else. And there's this wonderful moment where they find another maestro, they bang on his door in the middle of the night, and they open the door and they say, "Maestro, you are not only one of the finest conductors in the town, but also the nearest." It's always been my favorite scene.
I do get this sense of this. I mean, there is a lot of suddenly concerts are playing. I know an orchestra in London is planning a program involving Franz Schrecker, Bernard Herrmann. We're seeing a lot of contemporary stuff, a lot of interesting commissions. I do sense there's a sort of gravitational pull that everyone is still kind of very much hoping onto the idea there'll be a reset, that we will be able to swing back into normal way of doing things. Certainly what you say about touring, for a while people have been talking a good shout about well, I don't know, put it this way, the CEO of one British orchestra was busily on Twitter saying, this has ruined everything, there'll be no more touring for the foreseeable future. And I think it was literally the same day I had an email through from their marketing manager saying, we need to draft this press release about all our touring plans for next year. Make sure we're going to at least 12 countries, and it's business as usual.
Charlotte, you wanted to come in?
Well, yes, just talking about, we're talking about orchestras and how they're having to be far more fleet-footed, but it's something I've spoken to a lot of soloists and chamber musicians in recent months, and they're actually really, really enjoying it. And partly there's the whole artists who are also programmers who have festivals. They're actually enjoying being able to say, okay, well, we don't know what's happening in a year's time, but we know that we can perform Schubert tomorrow evening with this person who's already in town, and they're really valuing that. But also the thing that has been mentioned to me is that artists, the trouble if you are really A-lister artists and you have your diary pretty much booked for the next 3 years, is if you meet a wonderful artist who you really want to perform with, you're thrown together in a festival, for instance, and you play with each other, you can't actually make that happen either for another 3 years. And that's a source of frustration to people. And suddenly they've been able to, over this period, to say, we had that brilliant concert in January. My gosh, do you want to do something like now, 3 months later? And they've been able to do that. So I think that is incredibly rewarding for all of them. And actually speaking to soloists as well about the touring issue, I think there's been a degree of relief. I think there is a balance to be struck in the future world. On the one hand, the international touring for soloists has to continue for so many reasons, beginning with the fact that not every single country has enough national soloists at the right level in order to sustain a high level concert life. But soloists within that, somebody said to me recently, I mean, I'd known for years that it wasn't healthy and that I wanted to spend more time with my family rather than being in Hong Kong today and Azerbaijan tomorrow and then in Georgia, whatever. But you couldn't get off the treadmill. We couldn't stop because everybody was doing it.
Yeah.
And they were saying to me, I want, however it looks in the future, I want to be more at home. I want to be with my family more.
One of the great pleasures of this podcast has been discovering music, because I don't know whether the listeners necessarily know, but we never tell each other the choices before we start the podcast. And sometimes that's been evident because we've often chosen the same thing, of course. But I think that's definitely a plus here, because it means we can be surprised by things and discover them along with everybody else. And gosh, I mean, I've discovered so much music. I mean, there's corners of Wagner's output that I never imagined or indeed were even remotely interested in discovering until Richard mentioned them. And there's been plenty of female composers, for example, not heard of, who I've been told about, that I've put together the Spotify playlist and started listening to that music, which has been great. Fiona, do you remember we did works since 1980? So music that's been written in the last 40 years. And Gillian Moore from the South Bank Centre was our guest on that one. And there was a lot of really fascinating music in that. I mean, one of the pieces that I can't remember who chose it now is Ligeti's Hamburg Concerto. It might have been Gillian, actually.
I think Gillian chose it.
She's a big time Ligeti fan, and I love Ligeti, but I didn't know that piece at all, and I ran off to listen to that, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my favourites of his pieces now. It's been great to do that, hasn't it? To discover.
It's interesting that there were certain works that came up in several categories, and even though we've all got quite different tastes, that there's sort of the Venn diagram, we do overlap in the middle, but I think Nixon in China seemed to come up over and over again. Yes. And I would like to put in a wave a flag for of all the podcasts I took part in, where I was so ignorant, and by the end had sort of drawn a little map of my ignorance in a notebook, which of course I've since lost. And that was the British Symphonies, where Richard has a phenomenal knowledge and left me absolutely gasping. And I have never worked so hard for nothing as I did that week, trying to inform myself of composers who, of course, I've now forgotten, but with many lovely discoveries. And that was a particular pleasure. And I think we did take some really quite narrow subjects which had looked unpromising and turned out to be very rich.
Yes, the British Symphonies one was with Sir Mark Elder.
Yes.
And he chose some really interesting ones. But the thing that everyone was talking about at the end of that one, and funnily enough, exactly the same after we discussed works for chorus and orchestra with Simon Halsey, was the reputation of William Walton. Because neither of them were particular fans. And in fact, I think Simon Halsey said something along the lines of, if I never have to perform Belshazzar's Feast again, it will be too soon.
You're very risky going there again. That's very dangerous territory.
Absolutely. People were aghast at this. And in
fact,
I
agree.
In fact, poor Simon had to sort of slightly backtrack a little bit on Twitter because of it. And Mark Elder wasn't really a fan of Walton 1, which was a symphony that was bound to come up in the conversation about British symphonies. And indeed, Richard, actually, you should tell me, there was there's an incredible Twitter not competition, but sort of popular British symphonies, wasn't there, run by whoever it is who runs it?
I did not know who ran it, and I mean, at one point I pitched to an editor, and I actually trying to find this person, interview them, but they weren't interested. But basically this person who remains anonymous, possibly we know them, I don't know. We may be someone in this room, in this podcast. I don't know.
You, Richard?
It certainly wasn't me, I can assure you that. But it was, they understand all this stuff about league tables and seeding and all this sporty sounding stuff, which means nothing to me. But they assembled 488 British and Irish symphonies, mostly from the 20th century. They found a recording on YouTube or Spotify or some other platform of every single one of them. And basically we worked through all these 488 symphonies in a process. I literally started in April and finished only 2 weeks ago. Well, only last week, I think.
And the winner was?
The winner was Vaughan Williams 5.
Yeah.
in the end, there's a very close battle between the two Elgar symphonies in the final five. There's also, I mean, I rather, based on our podcast and what emerged from that, I predicted that the final four would be Walton 1, Elgar 1 and 2, and either Vaughan Williams 4, 5, or 6. And I was quite pleased with how it panned out.
You were right. Yeah.
The surprising thing was Hans Gahl, the symphonies of Hans Gahl were massively championed online by a colleague and friend of mine, Ken Woods, a conductor, who happens to have recorded all the Hans Gahl symphonies. I think he's the only conductor ever to have recorded a complete Hans Gahl symphony. And he's artistic director of about 6 different things in Britain and America, and was rather cunningly using the Twitter accounts to great effect to drive.
Very good, yes.
Culminating at one point to which the Elgar Festival in Worcester, in which he is artistic director, was urging people in the voice of Edward Elgar not to vote for him, but to vote for Hans Gahl instead. I mean, that's how you do it. That is advocacy. That's all. Right. More conductors need to be that passionate.
I wasn't Vaughan Williams 5 Mark Elder's choice.
Yes,
it was.
Yes, it was.
Maybe everybody was listening to the podcast and was so impressed by him that they all voted for it.
I'm totally going with that theory.
I mean, a few things that emerged in that Twitter competition were ones actually that emerged in our podcast as sort of secret favourites. Bax 3 and Spring Fire by Bax were 2 works that came out of that. The big love for Vaughan Williams 5. And I mean, another one of the stories of the podcast, again, is just how much love there is out there for the music of Malcolm Arnold.
Yes.
And his symphonies, which, I mean, I think we sort of sit in our silos thinking we're the only person that gets this composer. We're fighting a lonely corner. And actually, it turns out everyone else is quietly thinking.
Well, the recording of the Dancing Master has had a lot of attention.
Funnily, it was classical top 5. It was one of Tommy's choices on, which one was it? Music for Lockdown 2 that actually got me into Arnold, really. I mean, Fiona talking about works that she just hadn't, ignorant about. I'm afraid Arnold, for me, I listened to him, I had a good listen about 10 years ago, and I'm afraid I decided it wasn't for me, and I hadn't given it much of a thought since, other than admiring him on an academic level. And then Tommy named the Symphony No. 5, and I went and listened, blown away by it. People talk about Dutilleux being sort of the great 20th century colorist.
Yeah.
And I sat there thinking, my gosh, no, it's Arnold, like with 10 bells on. Yeah. So yeah, Arnold for me was one of my classical top 5 discoveries this year.
I must say, I mean, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've had an amazing group of guests on this show. I mean, really fantastic. And I mean, I have so many favourites, but and I'll mention them. But I have to say that last week's programme on male singers with Sir Thomas Allen was such a pleasure. I mean, one of the great pleasures I think this programme is listening to a lot of musicians talking with such passion about the people that they love listening to and the music they love listening to, but also being able to properly articulate why. I think we often these days put too much pressure or expect musicians to just be able to talk in interviews. I mean, I've spent my entire career interviewing people and expecting them to do really well in those interviews. And of course, it's a bit like actors. We always expect actors to be amazing personalities in interviews, when actually we are used to them being amazing actors, not real people, if you know what I mean. And I think it's the same with musicians, because of course, they speak through their instrument. And in a way, it's luck when they are so good at talking about it. And I think we've picked some terrific ones. I mean, Stephen Huff was another one who talked about piano concertos. It's such a fascinating talker, an incisive look at those pieces. And he brought up some surprises as well, like Tippett's piano concerto is one of his favorites. I'm so thrilled that he picked that. But Tom Allen, what I loved listening to was him describing things about the voice, the technical things about the voice and the sonority of the voice and why it spoke to him in a particular way, in a way that really I think only other singers can do. He's hearing a voice in a different way to the rest of us, I think, inevitably as a fellow singer. But I found that absolutely fascinating. I don't know about you guys.
It was also the stories that he told. I mean,
well, yes.
The things that I love about our job is the fact that you are interviewing people who have all of these stories to tell about people who are no longer with us. We're just too young to have interviewed ourselves or even perhaps seen. And hearing him talk about Peter Pears, hearing him talk about John Vickers. Actually, after we recorded on Wednesday, I went and I just YouTubed John Vickers and just sat there watching his square mouth belting out this extraordinary music, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of moments in that. The other one, actually, just a week or so before was Simon Callow, who he's not a professional musician, but clearly in our podcast has such a deep love for classical music, and it was great to talk song cycles with him. You know him, don't you, Fiona? I think he's a friend of yours.
I do. I've taught him everything he knows about music.
Well, you've taught many people everything they know about
if only
music.
that were true. I have to withdraw that in case anybody believes me.
But we all know what a great speaker he is, Simon. I mean, he's got a great voice, of course he has. But to hear him actually talk about music, rather than acting or Dickens, or although he did talk about Dickens, to actually hear him talk about music. I mean, again, it's great to hear people who've got an extra passion that you might not necessarily be aware of. He's particularly good at that, isn't he?
Yeah, I thought I was just thinking of somebody else who has another life that we did early on, which I thought was a particularly interesting one, if quite specialist, and that was Philip Hencher talking about books about music, which led us in so many different directions. And I think that was something that normally we don't get a chance to discuss. It's just too remote a subject, and yet it can interest anybody who has a love of music. And it was and he's a fine musician himself, Philip. So that was a particularly good one for me.
And Jeff Andrews as well of the BFI. Talking about films about music rather than film music, which was extremely some fascinating things I'd never ever heard of. And it's nice to be able to talk about Amadeus and.
Yes, and it was nice to talk about Ken Russell. Always like a good excuse to talk about Ken Russell.
I have to apologise to anyone who we inadvertently led to watch Ken Russell's Marlowe, which I still think is a work of genius.
Yes, I know you do.
I still apologise to anyone who watched it on our account.
The ones that have always been the most challenging for me are the ones about opera. We haven't yet done a properly Baroque one, but when we do, that will be the biggest challenge for me. But opera, I'm such a 20th century or 21st century opera person that when we did operas before 1900, I very much took a back seat on that one. But luckily, we had the wonderful David Paltney. Again, to hear music being talked about from another perspective, that of the director. We so often hear about directors going in the wrong directions and they just do this, that, and that. We hate the direction. We love the music, but we hate the director and all this sort of stuff. But to hear someone like Paltney talking about music on that level, I loved that. I could have listened to him all day talk about why he chooses particular operas to direct. And then also his just almost forensic knowledge of that music, which I guess as a director, you really need. I love that. But to be honest, my absolute favorite in that sphere was Peter Sellers for 20th century operas. I mean, he's been such an important part of late 20th century operas, and they haven't always worked. And I love Peter Sellers as a person. I think as a director, he sometimes has just left me completely thinking, what on earth is he doing? and often I've seen some of the more later ones and thought they were very dated. But the stuff he did with, Nixon in China, which Fiona has already mentioned, stuff he did with John Adams is just extraordinary. And to have him on again, what a great articulate advocate for music of all kinds, not just 20th century music. But he was great, wasn't he, Fiona? I really enjoyed Peter on the show.
Yes, and he was actually, I can't claim to know him, but I've interviewed him a few times, and I thought he would never stop talking, but he was so disciplined in his answers. I thought that was an insight in itself, that he does have that incredible discipline, even though he's so loquacious as a human being.
Yes, it was proof
he let us all speak.
It was proof that he'd read my email beforehand. Charlotte, another really interesting one, because what we specialise, of course, on this podcast is absolutely ridiculous subjects to discuss that you could possibly really pick 5 of. And also, I like to leave it a little bit open for interpretation. And one of those, of course, was most significant moments in music. And Nicholas Kenyon was our guest for that, the managing director of the Barbican and previously controller of Radio 3. That was quite a challenge, wasn't it?
It was a challenge and a joy. There were a few, I think, that were obvious choices. I mean, you picked Rite of Spring for that one, and I didn't pick it because I knew you were going to pick it. And there were certain ones that so it was a challenge, but it just a joy as well. I mean, Nick was absolutely wonderful. I mean, he is such a musicologist, and he wears it so lightly at the same time. He's so articulate, so enthusiastic. You get all of that hard musicology without even realizing that that's what you're getting. And hearing him talking about Bach's musical offering was one of my favorite moments. I think he really brought it to life.
Yeah. He one of the other things that came up in that program, I picked Now as one of music's most significant moments, because we don't really, as previously discussed, we don't really know what's going to happen. But I enjoyed that one because I think, we all have a different idea of what is significant and what isn't in music, and that's the beauty of it. Richard, I want to bring up Wagner because you failed to do so all the way through the year. No, I think one of the great, as I come back again.
I love how this is a thing. Apparently, if you talk about Bach or Britain incessantly, no one thinks there's anything odd about that.
No, I was
and let's face it, some people do.
I was going to say that. That's the very thing. The very thing I was going to say was that because I keep banging on about Britain and Malcolm Arnold, but no. What the serious point was that you've introduced me to a lot of Wagner that I would never have otherwise listened to. But I did at least, I hope you appreciate, save up my favourite bit of Wagner and actually say that I think it's the greatest moment in all music. So in Götterdämmerung. So I did at least build up to it, at least through silence, I suppose, up until that moment. But I think, and again, this is one of the great things about the program, that passions emerge. Because another one of yours, of course, is operetta. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of our listeners won't know very much operetta. And do you often feel that you need to get it out there to people to fully appreciate it?
Well, it's sort of like I say, we have our Bible and Shakespeare choices, don't we? We have so many topics, what people are going to choose. And I sometimes have a feeling for what my colleagues, what you're going to choose. And I'm always reasonably safe grounded, assuming no one else is going to choose something by G&S or by Huff and Bach. There's a certain element of that. I don't know. I think it's everyone has their little specialisms and niches, don't they? There are things that they kind of feel they enjoy and that speak to them in a way more than other things. I mean, for me, I would say part of this whole process has been, I don't know, but remembering to keep that open mind, to be aware of other people's experiences and pleasures. I mean, I Stephen Johnson, who came to talk to us about Russian symphonies, famously wrote an absolutely astonishing book about Shostakovich and his personal relationship with Shostakovich, some of which came out in the program. Now, he devoted a lot of that book to Shostakovich's Fourth Symphony, which is a piece I've tried to listen to and I just couldn't even comprehend, I just couldn't understand what anyone could hear in this, apart from conductors who like making a loud, raucous noise at great length. There are quite a few of those out there, so we know. And Stephen, to me, it was inconceivable this piece could ever mean anything profound or significant or deeply personal to anybody. And Stephen speaks with such sincerity, such thoughtfulness, and such obvious, insight and humanity that it's impossible. You can't maintain that position, and you have to accept that even if the piece doesn't speak to you or doesn't particularly enthuse you, that there's something there that you need to recognise that you should try and open your mind a little more. And I get that whenever I hear, certainly talking with Fiona talking about Baroque music earlier in the series, a lot of things there that I previously not really felt I could click with, which made me. It gives you a way in when you hear someone else explaining so eloquently what it is about the music that speaks to them, and likewise Charles, and likewise with you, this obvious enthusiasm for certain works by Benjamin Britten that I had always dismissed as these sort of damp academic East Anglian exercises. To realise that people genuinely feel.
Should we unpick
genuinely
those
feel emotion
prejudices
about these things, and it's it's reminded,
For me,
reminded of this. It's very, very, very good.
talking of open minds and Stevens, for me, it hasn't even just been open minds about repertoire, it's been open minds about performance. Stephen Huff was one of my absolute favourite guests, and most particularly one of my favourite moments, even among the guests, was when he was talking about Beethoven for the Fourth Piano Concerto. Yeah. Now, this is my favourite piano concerto. I absolutely love it. And I'm ashamed to say that I had my set idea of how I thought I needed to hear it. And I've become always a little bit of a gatekeeper about it. The first few chords, that was make or break in any performance or recording. And if they didn't do what I wanted them to do, then they'd kind of lost me, to be honest, I'm ashamed to say. And then along comes Stephen, and he talks about it. First of all, this fascinating story about the psychology of the whole thing. And you've got this pianist coming in, and then suddenly the orchestra come in on a different key, and there's kind of a joke, only it's not really a joke. But the thing about it was the way he was talking about rolling chords, the whole sort of idea of improvisation. And suddenly this thing which in my head was these profound opening chords, and Stephen was saying, well, are they, or is it kind of a little bit of a joke at a sort of start of an improvisation? And the funny thing was that I got to the end of that, and I didn't think necessarily that what he was describing as how he wanted to hear it was necessarily now what I think I want to hear. I haven't necessarily changed my view on what I like, but what I have changed my view on is being open-minded to other interpretations of my most famous work. And it was interesting because Lahav Shani has just released Beethoven 4 with Rotterdam on CD with Beethoven 7, I think it's coupled with. And I stuck it on the CD player a couple of weeks ago. And he played those opening chords at a slightly different tempo to the one I would normally, and it was just a little bit gentler than I normally would go for. But I thought, no, listen. And I listened to the whole thing, and I listened again, and I will keep listening. And I appreciated it for what it was. And I would say that that's actually, given this, how this work has always sat in my head, that was purely thanks to Stephen.
Yeah. No, I love that one too. A lot of the music that I've been discovering through the program has been suggested by our listeners. You guys see a lot of those suggestions too on the Facebook page and on my page as well, and on Twitter. One of the things I absolutely love, and it's typical of the classical music community, if you want to call it that, is just how much effort some people go to pick a 5 that they know you've never heard of, and then convince you that they are genuinely the best of those pieces or performances ever. I love that. So, if it was works for chorus and orchestra, literally no one is going to pick Carmina Burana, because why would you? It's so popular. Oh my God. No, much better to spend a good couple of hours on the internet and find one that no one's heard of. I love that. I think it's great. But of course, the result of that is these great discoveries, music of composers I'd never heard of, pieces I'd never heard of. Fantastic. I want to see more and more and more of that from our listeners, because it really has opened up this incredible, I mean, what Richard was saying about just British symphonies, nearly 500 British symphonies, that's incredible. And the vast majority of those we won't have heard before, and off we go to discover them. I think that's amazing.
It's interesting that for people who haven't yet, and let's hope many more will, discovered why we're so crazy about listening to all this stuff, which we have to call classical music, that it is not a narrow field. It is vast. It is vast. Yeah. I've spent all these years listening. I feel I'm just beginning. There's so much I don't know. Yeah. And it is like an entire world. And I think that when people think that it is something a bit dusty and very, very sort of like looking in a very small glass case with some very tiny old things in, and it's such a riot of noise out there. Yeah. And such a pleasure discovering it. We're jolly lucky.
There was I think it was the Moskovsky piano concerto came across. Panufnik was another one I think I mentioned, piano concerto I really wanted people to hear, because the Panufnik piano concerto is terrific. I heard it done with Michael Seal conducting CBSO, with Peter Donahoe playing the piano. Fantastic. And it was only like the third performance of it or something for a long time. And these are pieces that need to be heard. I mean, obviously right now they're far less likely to be heard than ever before, but hopefully when we kind of get back on track, a lot of these pieces are going to get into the repertoire. That's been such a pleasure for this whole thing. Charlotte, you said about Malcolm Arnold. I'm so thrilled that you reacted to that piece so positively. I mean, that was really the idea, and I know other people who've done the same, who've written to us on Twitter about discovering that piece too. Are there any others that you can think of that you didn't really know previously?
Gosh, yes.
Discovered?
Yeah. Vaughan Williams' London Symphony, where we were talking about orchestral solos, and that was one that was suggested on Facebook. I didn't know it. I now can't stop listening to it. So yeah, that one. And then a rediscovery as well. Walton's Cello Concerto. I loved when I first heard it. Then I went for years without hearing it. And again, it popped up from one of our lists. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'd forgotten that even existed. Of course, again, that's one that I can't stop listening to now. And then also just because sometimes you get the cold fear. You announce what our subject is for the next week and you think, hell, I do not know enough about that. I'm going to have to seriously mug up this week. And for that one, funnily, I mean, Russian symphonies struck the fear of whatever into me. And so I went and I mugged up like nothing else. And partly, I mean, it was lovely. Stephen was obviously a wonderful guest, but it was a nice it knocked some of my imposter syndrome out, realizing that I could actually talk about it. But also Glazunov was one of the composers that I discovered when I was really mugging up. And I thought it was so funny that this program then turned into this Glazunov 5 love-in with me and Richard and Stephen, whoever would have thought. Actually, I was listening to that last night. It turns out it's brilliant Christmas music. If you don't want to listen to Christmas music right now, but you want something a little bit festive, stick Glazunov 5 on. It's great.
Let me plug some more Glazunov, because there is I played this. I discovered Glazunov in my youth orchestra. We played a piece by his ballet suite, Scène de Ballet, Opus 52, and it is an alternative Nutcracker suite. I'm not joking. I think you knew that's what he was doing. You listen to it; it's obvious he's taken Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, the suite, for the ballet as his model, and has just done his own little version of it. And it's pure Glazunov, and it's such a homage to Tchaikovsky. And if you want a bit of variety, that's my top seasonal pick of Russian music. It's a Glazunov Scène de Ballet, Opus 52. It's absolutely delightful music. Some of it made it into his Ballet Raymonde as well, but it's about a little 25-minute ballet suite, just like the Nutcracker, and it's like you can always spot where he's thinking, oh, I can do that. Oh, here's where I do a violin solo. Here's my waltz. Here's my trepak. It's
I want to put a special mention in for an American conductor called Christopher Russell, who's a friend of mine and works in Orange County in California. He, without question, has introduced me every week to a new Russian composer that I absolutely should have known about and didn't. Always interesting as an alternative to Shostakovich, because Shostakovich is one of those composers that just comes up again and again and again across so many different subjects that we've discussed this year. And Chris is very much well, if you like that, why don't you try this? But in a much more interesting way than Amazon do, for example. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely opened up a whole other world of Russian music to me, and particularly as an alternative to Shostakovich, very much in the same world as Shostakovich, but a different voice. I've really, really appreciated that. And there's been a number of people who've consistently come up with fascinating choices, and I go off to listen to them. I love that about this program too. Fiona,
I'd quite like the idea that in a sort of quiet, subversive way, both Richard and I, when it's possible, not when it's Russian symphonies or English, British symphonies, but we both, in our different ways, tried to get Haydn in.
Oh yes,
we both have a sort of. Richard has a formidable knowledge, and I have a flimsy enthusiasm and a bit of knowledge. But we both have a sort of thing about Haydn, string quartets, and this whole wealth of music that should be in every list if we can possibly push it in there.
Yes, I'm guilty of mentioning Bernstein too much. I always get told off. after the
Well,
program.
it's a good counterpoint to Bernstein, I think, to say Haydn and Bernstein. I mean,
they go together so well. I mean, Bernstein's Haydn is so terrific.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. He just he's there at the very first one we did, wasn't he? I think we both chose Haydn, didn't we, in the very first lockdown edition? Because it's lockdown music. I brought him up again in the lockdown edition the other week, and we had that fantastic conversation with Robin Ireland, formerly of the Lindsay.
Yes.
String quartet. It's
just
fantastic.
Basically
which Haydn quartet we're going to each choose, of the many available. And one of those life of. I mean, I'm not an expert. I can't claim anything really like that. It's very kind of you to say so. Don't have a depth of knowledge. I've just made a lot.
Well, you give a very good impression of it. Show me your secret.
Cultivated illusion. So I don't know. I've played a lot of it over the years. So that's because I like it. But I like I say, it's when we all find ourselves suddenly aligning. It's when suddenly everyone sort of comes. Surprisingly, you discover we all love the same thing. Absolutely, some of my favourite moments, like Charlotte said there at Glazunov, I couldn't believe my ears. I thought, I'm going to have to make an argument here. No one's going to really buy that I love this music. And then it turns out, same with Malcolm Arnold, me and Tommy, and Mark Elder. Same with. As you say about Haydn, so many people we're aligned and sort of discover we all loved Haydn.
We both loved Rachmaninoff, the Bells, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Yes, we suddenly thought this is something nobody will mention.
Isn't that really irritating when that happens?
What surprised me most delighted me was the massive outpouring of absolute love for the genius of Leroy Anderson.
Oh yes, I was going to mention that. Yeah,
and it said it could have been top 5 Leroy Anderson pieces.
Easy.
That week.
Easy. I loved listening. The music that I listened to in prep for that week was a total joy. And sometimes you realise it because I spend so much time listening to what might be described as difficult music, which I love. But then to then just be diving into the world of Leroy Anderson and just like slipping into this beautiful warm bath and just going, lovely. That was total joy. Yeah.
Charlotte again in the Haydn C major cello concerto. I mean, find someone who loves that piece more than I do. It's a nice thing. No, really. And Stephen Isserlis loves this as well.
Do you know? I think one of the best moments. I mean, it's such a shame that listeners couldn't see this, but one of the best moments of the entire season for me was Stephen Isserlis's face when Richard mentioned the Goulder cello concerto. It was absolutely priceless.
Yes.
You either get it or you don't really, don't you?
I want to make a little mention of the specials that we've done as well. We've done done 3 classical top 5 specials where I've interviewed various people, and for example, it was such a joy to talk to James Galway. Such a popular figure, and one that often people forget really had the chops. He was principal flute of the Berlin Phil during the Karajan years, which we talked about, and we mostly spent that podcast talking about the great conductors that he worked with. He worked with them all at that time, all the great conductors, and that was fascinating. And also then talking about the huge effect he had on the world of flutes in the 70s when he was appearing on all the big popular chat shows and inspiring a new generation of flautists, even if they didn't quite know it yet. And I mean, one of those, of course, was another guest on the podcast, Gareth Davis, the principal flute of the London Symphony Orchestra, who came on to talk about sort of significant moments in his life. He was one that was inspired to take up the flute simply by seeing James Galway on the telly. That was great to talk to him. Another one was an old colleague of mine, Brian Kay, from Radio 3, of course, the founder member of the King's Singers, just to talk to Brian. I mean, Brian's got a great voice anyway, of course he has, but just to talk to him about the early years and the development of the King's Singers was fabulous. And again, to remember that beyond the chat show appearances and all the popular stuff, they commissioned a lot of really important composers to write for them. And so it was great to talk to them. And then last week, talking to 3 members of London Brass, this kind of elite group of brass players. That again, also a pleasure. Just talk about who inspired them, and talk about the Philip Jones Brass Ensemble. Again, such a key group as far as the development of brass playing is concerned, and also creating this huge repertoire. So I really enjoyed doing the specials. Perhaps we should just finish off with a quick kind of highlights from all 3 of you. just as we finish off this year. It can be from the program, or it can be anything at all from 2020. A year that hasn't exactly been packed with real highlights, because it's been such a shocking year for everyone, and we mustn't make light of that fact. But I'm sure there have been some highlights for all of us. Fiona, how about you?
Okay, I suppose the places that managed to keep going, and I know that people who didn't keep going, there were very good reasons for that too, but Wigmore Hall, Snape Maltings, one of the first concerts I went to was at Snape, and it was wonderful to be back there, and actually to see they put up a very un-Aldborough-like coffee place, painted a very discreet grey colour, in keeping with the sky, and it was a slightly different atmosphere from the usual Aldborough, but they were moving with the times and responding to a very difficult situation. So thumbs up to them.
By the way, I'm presenting the last Wigmore Hall concert of this season, and it's been an extraordinary season for them, hasn't it? I mean, they led the way, didn't they?
Yeah.
Not just in creating concerts, but also showing such extraordinary support for the performers, for the musicians.
I think in saying we will put these concerts on, whether there's an audience or whether there isn't, we will do it, and they have.
And of course, on Monday there will be no audience. The only people in the hall, apart from the performers, who are the Cardinals Music, will be me and John Gilhooly, who runs Wigmore Hall. So it'll be a very strange experience. Charlotte, a highlight for you from this past year.
Okay, well, from the podcast itself, I mean, another couple of highlights would be Works to Shelve and Works to Resurrect. That gave me an awful lot of satisfaction. And also Catherine Bott, that was an awful lot of fun, and particularly when for me, she was really the person through whom I got into listening to vocal music. So that was very, very wonderful. But I think more widely, the highlights of the year for me have actually been all of the things where there has been face-to-face contact. I think that's one of the things that we've all been starved of this year. It's been face-to-face contact and live music. So the couple of live music concerts I saw this year, there was a wonderful one in Bremen that I had to go to for the Strad, had in inverted commas. But also, I mean, Classical Top 5, actually just having 5 human faces to interact with each week has been wonderful. And the interviews that I've done as well for Gramophone and the Strad over the year, just even if I'm not in the room with the artists and we're just over Zoom, it's been just like a balm for the soul to be able to speak to somebody face to face about music, about the thing that we've literally our whole lives have been about since our kiddie years. And suddenly we're all cut off for each other.
Richard, you got a new cat, and a very friendly one at that. I know that's definitely going to be one of the highlights of this year. But
sleeping on the armchair behind us, you just see his silhouette. He looks like a cushion.
Lovely.
He's very good. He has tried to intervene a few times in the past.
But what about musically? A highlight for you this year?
I already mentioned, I think, my trip to Glyndebourne during that brief window of activity we had in the autumn, and just at the Offenbach operetta at Glyndebourne. What's it called? Mademoiselle de Mesdames de la Halle was the operetta, the original title. They called it In the Market for Love, and it's just like I say. I mean, escapism is what I've craved from music, really. That and the face-to-face contact, the live experience, everything everyone has said about that. But on that occasion, you had all of those things. You have people in a venue doing what they normally do and not trying to make it about how terrible everything is and how depressing everything is, which, we can get at home 24/7 and through any number of channels all year long, who is just actually music doing what it does, raising the spirits, showing you another world, brightening things, opening your perspectives, refreshing the spirit. What Haydn used to say, he aimed to refresh the spirit with his music, and that certainly did. It was just entertaining, delightful. It was unapologetic and great. I hope they do more often, but I think it really showed the value of this music this year, the value of music. On the podcast, we've not today mentioned James Macmillan's podcast early, and for me that's the one that
Sacred Music.
Yeah, Sacred Music. I just keep coming back to that because he is such an incredible mind, such an incredible creative individual. I think he's the only full-time composer we've had on so far. Is that right? Stephen Huff is a composer, of course.
True. Yeah, no, you're right.
Sure, plenty of other people probably dabble, but he is the only person we've had on who is makes his life's work through composing, and just his perspectives, his way of so different perhaps from the conventional way of looking at classical music, at the same time so utterly serious, so utterly thought through, felt, so profound. His comment about the idea that Tristan and Isolde is a sacred work, a sort of massive metaphor, a massive metaphor for the passion, massive process of putting such a cosmos. I mean, that you know, what they say, mind blown, I think is the phrase that I had. I came away reeling from that discussion and absolutely thinking in a different way about everything we've talked about. He's such a thoughtful, intelligent, pleasant, kindly, and at the same time opinionated man. I mean, I respect all of that enormously, and he was, you know, that was for me was a real high point.
I think I've already said what my favorite podcasts were, but for me, musically, Fiona mentioned Wigmore Hall, and when I was asked to present some of those live streams at Wigmore Hall, it meant such an enormous amount. I think John Gilhooly knows what to do when it comes to valuing people, and it was a strange feeling to me because I hadn't done anything all year, of course, for money, and this was actually for money. In a really terrible year for me business-wise, because every single thing that I had planned in the next 2 years was cancelled. So it had been quite challenging. So merely being asked was this huge vote of confidence, which made a massive difference to me. I hadn't done any concert presenting in that way, broadcasting, for a long time. I've done on-stage stuff many times, of course, but not like this, like on radio. So just to do that, even under such odd circumstances, was such a pleasure to do. And it made me feel like there was some value left in that, hugely important. And I know a lot of the musicians that were asked to play felt exactly the same way. As I said, I'm doing the last one of the season on Monday, and I'm hoping that there's going to be more in the new year. I know they're planning some. But I have to say that one of the biggest highlights of all has been this podcast. And I have to say thank you to all of you, to Fiona, to Richard, to Charlotte, because a meeting like this every week has been an absolute lifeline. It's been fun, but it's also been incredibly important because it's kept our brains moving about a bit, particularly mine, as well. I'm not writing for any publications on any deadlines. So it's been such a pleasure to do it and to just learn so much. I mean, we've all mentioned about our specialist areas. Just brilliant to hear all of that and to be exposed to so much new music, not always new music, but, new old music. Fabulous. I've really enjoyed it. So I want to say thank you to all of you, because as I said, I think last week, we all do this for free. We do it because we love it. And I know we all do love doing this. So thank you all very much for doing the podcast. And I'm so pleased that we are going to continue with it in the new year. And I also want to say, by the way, a big thank you to our producer, Simon, because he puts a huge amount of effort into making us sound good after we finished and preparing it all so that we can put it out as a podcast. And he also does it for free and doesn't have to. So huge thank you to Simon as well for all his work on that. I also want to say a huge thank you, of course, to our listeners, thousands of them all over the world. As I've said, your suggestions continue to surprise us and to bring joy to us and such interest. So please do keep your suggestions coming in for all the subjects that we suggest. I have a competition for you. I mentioned it at the beginning. This is the competition of the year. No question about it. You can win a special edition, exclusive classical top 5 face mask. They're wonderful. And I've taken a photograph of it. I shall put it up on Twitter and on Facebook so you can see what you might win. All you have to do is answer this question and then email us the answer. The question is, and we've talked about it already in this podcast, so it's really a question of were you listening properly? Who was it? Which of our guests said that if he ever had to perform Belshazzar's Feast again, it would be too soon? Which of our guests said that if he had to perform Belshazzar's Feast again, it would be too soon? He'll be delighted that I've made an entire competition around him saying this. But anyway, who was it? Please email your answers to classicaltop5@gmail.com. classicaltop5@gmail.com. 5 as a number, not as a word. classicaltop5@gmail.com. And the right answer will be selected at random, and the winner will be the proud owner into the new year, the envy of all your friends, a classical top 5 face mask. I'm really looking forward to receiving your answers there. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks especially to Fiona for joining us again. It's so wonderful to see you back here.
Oh, I hope I can come back again.
And you absolutely will. Thanks as always to Richard and Charlotte, and thank you all for listening. Just remains for me to wish you a very happy Christmas and New Year. Please have a very safe and healthy Christmas and New Year as best as you can. And we'll see you in the new year. Goodbye.